Welcome to this webinar today. We're in Atlanta, and it's kind of a chilly day in Atlanta, as it is probably in most parts of the central part of the United States. We're glad to have you joining us for this Crisis Coach webinar series that is presented and underwritten by the RenWeb organization. We invite you to become our friend at Facebook, Firestorm Solutions, and you can also follow us on Twitter at Firestorm Soul. We do have a hashtag, and that hashtag is Crisis Coach. Firestorm transforms crisis into value and empowers you to manage your risk and crises. Firestorm has expertise in crisis management, critical decision support, crisis communication, crisis public relations, and consequence management. Please keep in mind that this presentation is not complete without the accompanying oral comments and discussion. The content should be discussed with your organization's personal counsel. In addition, the information given and comments made should not be interpreted as legal advice or legal opinion. RenWeb is the co-host sponsor of this webinar series. This is the Crisis Coach webinar series. Today, we're starting a three-part series talking about building an intelligent network at your school. And how do you know what you don't know? Our presenter today is the president of Firestorm, Jim Satterfield.
So, Bill, I'm going to jump in because normally Jacqueline would be speaking at this point, but she is helping a RenWeb school as we speak, and she asked if I would fill in for her today. And we're certainly glad to do that, and we're glad to have all of you with us today as we talk about this. This quarter, we're going to be focused on building an intelligence network, and I think you'll hear some interesting new things, and also covering the area of behaviors of concern. And so hopefully today we'll give you some new thoughts and maybe help in establishing some new directions as you go forward as we work through each of these areas. So thank you to Jacqueline and to RenWeb. And if you have questions, feel free to reach back out to Jacqueline. She'll be glad to answer and support in that standpoint. I've certainly been impressed with what we've seen at RenWeb and what their systems do for your schools and help in those operational areas. My name is Jim Satterfield. I'm the president of Firestorm, and I thank you for letting me speak with you again today as we go forward. In every session, we generally talk about what's going on around us, and I think that the role of change in the world today remains a significant concern and awareness for all of us. I think we all are attuned to the events that happened yesterday in Paris, the terrorist attack and the deaths associated with that. I would remind you that after 9/11, Al-Qaeda had threatened our schools specifically. And think about the impact that a lone gunman or a coordinated team, as exhibited in Paris, would mean if you saw a series of those happening in schools around the country. As we focus on workplace violence and threats, unfortunately, we've seen those threats rise, not decline, as we think forward. And today is a different type of a threat as we think about behaviors of concern, and we'll share some unique insights around it. The other thing I'd like you to think about is communicable illness, and I know we've done some programs last fall on the Ebola. If I were to suddenly tell you that 28 children died in America from Ebola, you would be alarmed, and there would be a public outcry of great proportions. But I can tell you that there were 28 children who died of the flu in the United States this flu season. That number will go up and probably be significantly higher. And we sometimes discount risks that just seem minimal or that we're familiar with. Communicable illness is a significant threat, and you should use this as an opportunity to update your plan within your school and to coordinate. That threat continues to remain. Over half of the states in the country now have high levels of flu incidence and spreading, and we're seeing it impacting schools, both independent and public, in the marketplace. Additionally, some 8 states have measles outbreaks today, and the most prominent being the one that came from Disneyland and the exposures there. So as we look at this, think about not only the violence aspects and threats that are there, but the communicable illness as it would come together. The theme around how do you know what you don't know leads us to this question. Can you identify your school's next crisis? And I think that's an area that we're all thinking about, and we would rather be able to identify that, plan for it, or prevent or even mitigate it as it was occurring is certainly the goal that we've got as we go forward. And that's what this webinar series is going to help us focus in on, how you can identify your organization's next crisis and come together. The Firestorm process that you've heard us talk a lot about is predict, plan, perform. Under the predict, we talk about identifying the vulnerabilities and threats, what are their impacts, how are you going to monitor them, and triggers. So this series right now, today in particular, is going to be zeroing in on that predict function and how that element comes together, predicting what those risks and threats are, establishing how you monitor them, and what are the trigger points that cause you to take action and move forward. So as we think about today and the topic unfolds, I'd like you to keep that in mind as we carry forward. Now, in working with the schools, and Firestorm has been very fortunate in working with many of the RenWeb schools around the country, and in fact outside of the U.S. We're just finishing up a plan in South America for a school there to help and identify. The question comes back, and particularly within the organization, of who's responsible? Who's responsible for managing the risk and preparing the school for those risks and threats that are out there? And the answer to that is the board. So as an independent school, your board members share that responsibility to make sure that there are plans in place, as well as your senior leadership, your head of school and your administration as they're coming together. Across businesses, whether they're schools or businesses, we're finding that many management teams don't know how to identify the impending risk before they occur. And when you think about schools in particular, we do a lot of work around a fire drill. How do we exit the building if the building is on fire? Or we'll do tests and drills around the standard protocol of shelter in place, lockout, lockdown, evacuate. Both those fire drills and standard protocols are dealing with crises after they occur. How much better would it be if we could deal with the crises before they occur and prevent them? That's really when we think about risk, where we want to focus in knowing and learning how we know what we don't know. If we're not eliminated, these risks then will have a disproportional impact on our students, on our teachers, on our parents, our people, our brand, and our reputation. No head of school wants to have to pick up a phone and call and tell a parent their child's not coming home from school today. And that's the nature of what we're going to be focusing on in this three-part webinar series. It's focusing around creating an intelligence network and understanding those aspects of it. So can you really predict a crisis? That's a question we get asked regularly, and I would say loudly, yes. The answer to that is there, and it's because there are warning signs that go unheeded. And many times we'll find that those warning signs really were there, and there was no one who reported them, shared it, or put that information out. Most of the anonymous reporting programs that we've seen have failed. We talk a lot about see something, say something, but there's not a lot of saying that's going on. And we'll find in analysis after the effect that there were a lot of people who knew and they didn't come forward. So by focusing on these warning signs, we then learn that there are specific indicators, and we're going to use that term a couple of times today in talking about what the indicators of the crisis are, and develop processes and training to address those issues before they reach a crisis. That's what we feel that management, the school leadership, your board, you that are on the call today need to be doing in this area. Because one thing is for absolutely certain. If there was a crisis that occurred in their school, then the questions will be back, what did you know, and when did you know it, and what did you do? And there'll always be a Monday morning quarterback who comes back and says, well, you should have known that, and you could have done this, and you could have done that. And our research, when we've looked at these patterns, are dealing with the largest episode of workplace violence in the United States. That was the shootings at Virginia Tech, to the ones that you saw that occurred during the subsequent years, that there were indicators and patterns that were there. And those are shaped by the severity and frequency of the events. And we'll talk also about frequency and severity. How often is it happening? Severity, how bad is it? So there is value in identifying these pre-crisis indicators before the crisis happens, because it will make a significant difference to you and your school. So when we think about indicators, what those indicators are clue cues. Now that's a little bit of a tongue twister for me to say, clue cues, that give you information about emerging events. Converting that information into actionable intelligence is part of what the plans do that we talk about in these areas. Now these cues can be behavioral, the way that a teacher or a student is acting. It could be involved in transactions or processes. They could be verbal or they could be nonverbal. It could be a posting on social media, on Facebook or Twitter. It could be posting on Instagram. That information is out and being shared in the public domain, and the expectation is you know what's going on within your school. So there are several different ways that this evolves, and I want to start to try to help build that framework a little bit as we go forward. First of all, it's a building an awareness program. Everyone in your school needs to understand the warning signs of the behaviors of concern, and particularly I don't want us to forget threats and statements that are made. Threats are certainly a significant indicator and should be taken seriously, even if it's a kind of a maybe I'm upset, or a conditional threat. If this doesn't happen, I'm going to do that. Clearly the worst type of threat is I'm going to do this action to this person on this day. The more specific and credible the ability to deliver on that threat, the more of a concern that it would be for us. But if everyone in your school, your students, your teachers, your faculty, your staff, your administrators, all understand what the warning signs are and the indicators, having that information coming forward to you becomes absolutely critical. So one of the first things that you need to think about is how do you train everyone to understand what those behavioral and environmental indicators are? And then how do they report those to you before it escalates to a higher level? That's going to be an issue that will have to become a part of our program as we start to implement that. So how do you know what you don't know? Well, you have to create an intelligence network. If you don't have an intelligence network, that means that things are going on and you're not aware of them in your school, and others are. Our goal then is to know today what will happen tomorrow. And we do that following the predict, plan, perform process you've heard us talk about in this and other webinars. And our goal here is to transform uncertainty about what's happening into certainty so that you can plan and prepare for it. Have established metrics so that it'll be very clear that you took those activities there. We're going to want to know what, when, where, and what the pattern of life is for the individuals that are involved. Is this a substance abuse issue that we need to look at? And so the process here is that we must listen and look. Now we're going to talk about listen and look in another webinar later this year as we continue to go forward, but I want to give you a little bit of an insight into listening and looking, because that's going to be one of the fundamental aspects of building this intelligence network. And I want to start to bring you in line with that thought process. So when we think about listening and looking, listening is creating conversation aggregators. How do we take all the things that are being said, put them into some way that we can find out what's being communicated about our school and about our people? We utilize streams. Streams are made up of phrases. Phrases are made up of words. And this listening, this broad base, gives us a general situational awareness of what's going on. And there's specific tools that you can use to do this, and it's much more than just doing a Google search. So this is general. It tells us that there's a person going on, that there's a potential person of interest, that there's some type of an event that's moving on. Then we need to look at it. We need to now zero in and look at this person much more specifically. And that's focusing on a specific location, event, or the person that could be identified as a result of a crisis, a threat, a risk, an exposure, or vulnerability. We can use geocoding. We have the ability to put up a geofence around your school and look at postings that are coming out directly about it or a particular location. We have a time machine that you can go back into time and look and see what were they saying last week or last month, or looking at the sphere of influence, who else is involved in those communications. So looking is targeted. It's targeted awareness of what's going on. So you think about the listening as a general area, creating this general situational awareness, and then the looking then gives us the ability to do the investigation, even a virtual investigation to give us those insights. So our goal here is to get to a predictive intelligence basis in creating our intelligence network. So listening and looking. How are you today in your school listening? How in your school today are you looking? And how does this all come together with social media? So predictive intelligence is really the goal here. And communications are the most perishable forms of intelligence. What was said 2 years ago is not relevant in trying to figure out what's going to happen tomorrow in your school. So it's the ability to get that information in a timely manner so that it becomes actionable. And predictive intelligence involves both hard and soft data. Soft data could be behavior. It's the actions that a person carries forward. It could be intuition and experience. You know your students. You know your areas that are involved. Hard data really becomes those tangible things that we can look at, email, social media postings, any type of a threat or an admonition of intent. Now, technology really aids us in that hard data area, and there are specific tools that will aggregate that, give you the sentiment and the risk rating associated with it to do those monitoring analytics and provide you 24/7 reports so that you know what's going on in your school community. We do a lot of work with schools where we're jointly working with them, and the number of times every day across America that gun in school are used in a communication is over 60 times every single day. This is not just a public school problem. It's an independent school problem. It's an American problem associated with this as we look at it. So look at that because we're looking to try to create predictive intelligence by looking and listening to information that's in the public domain, and then we can perform actionable intelligence. Now, once we find that intelligence, we need to have a place to keep it. There has to be a central repository so that all of that becomes aggregated into one place at one time. It also helps us to keep from losing that information so that we, what this person saw plus what that person saw, put those two together, now we're in a situation where we have an effective analysis of what's going on. Because information gets siloed in many cases, and it gets lost in that process. So I'd like you to think now about creating this intelligence network and then focusing on predictive intelligence as we carry forward. We see 4 specific components here. One you're already doing, and you're probably doing a good job of background checks. And we've talked about background checks before, and we'll do that again coming up. But as we look at background checks, it's not only initially when you hire someone, it has the ongoing annual requirements associated with it. But if we can stop that problem from coming into our school, that's a great way to begin. Anonymous reporting, well, I've told you earlier that it's not working in general. We need to find ways to make that work, and we'll do a webinar specializing just on anonymous reporting and talking about the see something, say something, and how you convert that from being a catchy phrase into a key action. But if someone sees a behavior of concern, we have to find a way for them to report that so it goes into your database, into your ability to handle that information. That becomes a central repository that's absolutely essential. Behavioral risk threat assessment we're going to talk in greater detail about today. We've given you some general overviews in the past, but today we're going to kind of go under the covers and really specifically say, if we're getting this intelligence coming in, whether it's background checks, anonymous reporting, or the social media monitoring, what do we do with it? How do we screen it? How do we develop a plan associated with it? And that's the purpose for our conversation today. Social media risk monitoring that you see listed there, there are specific tools that you need to implement, and the expectation today by the parents is that you are in fact doing that. Now look at this definition of crisis that's down below those components of an intelligence network. A crisis is a risk event for which one has not identified the vulnerabilities and exposures, has not developed a plan, and therefore does not know how to respond. So what we want to be able to do is to deal with this so that it's a risk, not in an actual crisis. We will have to deal with it in a crisis, and unfortunately Firestorm has a history of working with schools in crisis and helping out in those areas. From our experience, we will tell you it's much better to be able to deal with this before it escalates to that level. So as we think about this, and now we go into more depth in the behavioral risk threat assessment area, you've seen us talk about this chart over to the right, the behaviors of concern. Our goal is to have you to intervene in the behaviors of concern before it escalates to threatening behavior, before there's physical injury, before there's death. So whether that's a thermometer or a barometer or whatever it is, we want you to be able to intervene at the behaviors of concern. So what do you do, and when do you do it? Well, if we take a look at all of the behaviors out there and we divide it into low concern, medium concern, and high concern, low risk, medium risk, and high risk, those things that are low risk, it's just a normal behavioral issue in the school that you can handle with your normal discipline. That's not what we're talking about. You're doing a good job. Continue to handle it the way you are. Those things, I think, are under control. So that lower end of the spectrum is easy. The higher end is also easy. You see someone with a gun, you're calling the police, you're intervening immediately because now we're dealing with a violence episode. That's high. Those are very easy. But what's in the middle? That gray area, those behaviors of concern, that medium risk, how do you identify them? What do you do if it falls into those? And what are the actions that you need to take? That's where we're going to focus now in leveraging this intelligence network that we've been talking about. Now, we divide those behaviors of concern into 3 separate buckets, one of them called guarded, one elevated, and one severe. We'll go through that in a slide a little bit later to talk about the characteristics and the actions that you need to take in each of those. But that's the difficulty. The simple things that are low risk, you know how to handle that. Those that are very high risk and that are on to the violence point, you know how to handle it. But these behaviors of concern, they're the precursors of the threatening behavior, the precursors of physical injury, the precursors of death. Those are the clue cues that we want you to be able to recognize and have that response in coming into place. So as we move forward with the behavioral risk threat assessment, we now want to talk about this needs to be a program. It's intended to assist in identifying, assessing, managing, and monitoring those people, those employees, those teachers, those students exhibiting behaviors of concern long before they pose this threat of violence. Intervening early makes the difference. That's the area that we want to focus on and have those impacts come into place. Now, it's got to be based on a framework. There has to be policies. There has to be training. There has to be specific goals. And I would encourage you now to start writing down what you're doing in these areas. Because as we've already said, you've got some of the basic components there. You know how to handle a normal discipline issue. You know how to handle that high-risk violence issue. But what about the gray area? How do we move this program beyond this and build this the program? There are 4 areas: awareness, reporting, central repository, and a plan. Awareness is making sure that everybody understands what the behaviors of concerns are. What are they? What are the triggers? What are the cues? What are the indicators that would go there? And then finding a way for your students and your employees to report it when they see it. And building a culture, that's who we are. We're concerned about our people, and we must respond. Having a central repository, because we find in many cases information gets siloed in schools. This person knew about it, but that person didn't. We've got to bring all of those things together in a centralized manner to be able to deal with it. And then a specific plan of, now that that's in place, what are we going to do with it? So the BERTHA plan, and BERTHA stands for Behavioral Risk Threat Assessment. It's the BE out of behavioral, the R out of risk, the TH out of threat, and the A out of assessment. It's an easier way for us to talk about it, to frame it as BERTHA. That's made up of investigation, screening, action plan, monitoring plan, sign-off, and record keeping. Those are the aspects that have to come into place to be able to properly deal with these areas. And that intelligence network becomes absolutely critical as we move forward. So there has to be an investigation methodology. If there was something going on in your school today, you've done investigations in the past. Have you documented that process? Do you have specific procedures and forms, an incident report form, how you do interviews, all of those elements that are coming together, because this becomes extremely critical that you do the same thing the same way every single time. Now, that's so that we won't miss something that's going along, but it also is protecting the school. What did you know and when did you know it will become a theme that will be asked if there is an episode that occurs within your school. Being able to document that we had a procedure in place and we followed our procedure becomes absolutely critical to minimize that liability. By the way, it's ultimately the responsibility of the board and the head of school to make sure that those procedures and methodologies are documented and that they're followed on a regular basis. We then need to identify and train who within your school is going to conduct the investigation and do the screening. Having them receive some training, having that process established makes a big difference in terms of the outcomes. In some cases, you might want to involve your legal counsel. Your board has a relationship with someone in the legal community, and in some cases, depending upon what the events are, there could be potentially privilege associated with it, and that will be important to determine as we go forward. You would then create a behavioral assessment team, and that's a minimum of 3 people and a maximum of 5. We would want someone out of the counseling area within the school, or if you have an HR function, that would be good. Security or someone from the administration. We don't want it to be less than 3 people, and we don't want it to be more than 5. That would meet on a regular basis to follow up and monitor the students that have had behaviors of concern, and then to screen students that now have exhibited a behavior of concern. And the screening tools that we feel that there are many good ones out there. There are strengths and weaknesses within each of those. Some of you are using the Secret Service or the FBI protocols, or you may be using Waiver 21, Mosaic, K-Wood, or any of the other programs that are out there. Everyone has a strength. Everyone has a weakness. But the key is doing the same way at the same time for each of these as we move forward. Training becomes very critical in the use of this and making sure that the implementation is carried forward. You've got to establish how your behavioral assessment team will be notified, because as events start to come up and you become immediately aware of a behavior of concern, it needs to be addressed at that time, not a week later. It has to be dealt with those activities, no matter if somebody's on vacation or there's another area, it has to be dealt with. We responded to a school who sat for a week after a behavior of concern had been manifested, and it certainly exacerbated the problem greatly by waiting to act. And then finally, upon conclusion of the investigation, your screening, you have to implement a corrective action. If the student or faculty member has a problem, we need to be able to intervene and to deal with that. So when we talk about a plan, and we've listed the components here, let's go and list those again in a slightly different way. And the investigation, that's where we start to look at it. We're looking at documentation. We're doing interviews with a teacher, with the students, with a parent, interview with anyone that came in contact with it to collect that information to be able to make a determination. Now, at this point in time, if it's minor, you're going to follow your normal discipline plans. If it's a serious threat, that 911 violence, life, and safety, you're going straight to the police. It's the gray area in between, that medium risk, where you're going to go through doing the screening and then dividing that into the guarded, elevated, and severe. That's where your behavioral assessment team comes into play. Now, in some cases, if you have doubt, then you'd want to involve a third party, a psychologist, a psychiatrist, a forensic psychologist, if you will, to render an opinion of, is this person a risk to themselves or to others. The action plan is how are we going to deal with it? What's the intervention in the short term, in the long term? It must be documented and then followed through and monitored by the behavioral assessment team. Now here's the monitoring again listed down below. That monitoring could be by asking teachers about what's going on, observing what you can, but in particular monitoring social media. What are the comments and postings that this person is putting out? What are the issues that others are saying about it? This is where the ability to monitor social media can become absolutely critical to creating your intelligence network, to know what those actions are and to take them and to carry forward with them before that escalates beyond a behavior of concern to threats and violence and death. And then finally, there has to be a sign-off. When you've completed all the forms, gone through the screenings, gone through the investigation, written the action plans, and do the monitoring, then you have to keep that information in a confidential central repository, because if another event comes in, we don't want to lose the fact of what we've already dealt with. So when we think about a behavioral risk threat assessment program, here are the components and descriptions that you need to have in place. Some of this you already have in your school. My recommendation is document it. Make it more formal. Make sure that your people have training. And we'll carry forward in doing that. And in fact, if there's a desire, let the people at RenWeb know and RenWeb know, so that at maybe the annual convention we could do a track just on how to do some of these individual elements and step you through some training at the annual user meeting. By the way, if you don't attend the RenWeb user meetings, you're missing a major opportunity to continue your education in a variety of topics that are germane to the operation of your schools. So when we talk about risk levels, and we're talking about now breaking this medium risk into 3 categories: guarded, elevated, and severe. And you've seen we've shown that kind of a green, yellow, red as a stoplight indicator to give you an area. If it's at that lowest level in the medium risk, it's not the low down below, but it's not that higher one, then there has to be some supervision of the person. There has to be some intervention. Maybe it's a conversation. Could be oral at this point in time. You would be setting up with them and having certain dates and follow-ups. We want to see that this behavior of concern de-escalates and becomes stable, or whatever the cause of it is has been removed within that process. If it's the elevated, in the group of 3 on the behavioral assessment team who've gone through the screening, whatever protocol you've done, and said, you know, it's not low, it's above that. Now you're going to have more supervision. It's going to have to be enhanced. There's going to have to be a specific intervention that goes into place regarding that particular person with specific follow-up included in those areas, because now we're still in the warning. It hasn't gone all the way to becoming a major concern, but we need to be much higher awareness. It's right in the middle of that medium risk area. That's when we talk about this being at an elevated risk element. And then finally, the severe risk. We aren't all the way up to the violence, but we're at that highest level in that medium risk area. We've got to take the student or the employee or the teacher out of the workplace, out of the classroom, out of the school, until they're judged no longer to pose a threat. Because if you felt they were at a severe risk level, you would never be able to explain to a parent why you allowed that to continue. And more importantly, we don't want to face the risk or to see the damage of the impact that could cause to have that person. Because what we're saying is that they have a high potential of being an imminent harm to themselves or others. We can only let them return when we have judged that they're no longer pose that threat. There has to be a written action plan and a written monitoring plan and specific reentry requirements to bring them back into the school environment. Documenting this so it doesn't appear subjective, that it says this is the procedure, this is the process that we're going to do, becomes absolutely critical to you. And we'll talk some more about these action plans in just a minute. So one of the biggest helps that we've found that schools that have adopted a behavioral risk threat assessment program to focus specifically on that gray area of medium risk, because that's where you need the assistance. Dividing it into this guarded, elevated, and severe approach will give you better insights in knowing what to do and when to do it and how to do it in that particular marketplace. Now, we've talked a lot about triggers or cues or indicators. Let me just kind of summarize some of those quickly for you today, and many of these that are aware. The highest concern we have is when there's threats. Threats, it's no longer enough to say, well, you know, that's just the way they are. No, it's not the way they are. Threats need to be considered real and actionable, and you need to have that at the highest level of looking at those. So any threat or report of a threat is an issue that you need to treat immediately from an intelligence network standpoint and put it through your behavioral risk threat assessment program. The next would be verbal behavior. Is the language abusive? Are they talking about certain things and actions here that would give you pause? Those would be clear indicators, things that people have overheard in that process. The written behavior, and that's the intelligence network again. What are they saying on social media? That information is there. It's in the public domain. Again, as I shared with you, we're seeing 60 times a day the gun in school being used in communications. We're seeing other threats that are coming directly there that are being shared, and as that information gets shared, it becomes knowledge. When a student says they're afraid to come to school tomorrow because of an action they have heard that's going to happen, wouldn't you want to know that in coming into it? When it's physical, fighting, any type of striking in those areas certainly would be a trigger or a recognition point. Sexual abuse, sexual molestation, unfortunately in our schools, it still is a large issue for us to be concerned about and carried forward. Again, we learn about many of these through the intelligence networks, and the postings on social media is another indicator. If you're not looking there, it's going on, it's in your school, and you're unaware of it. Domestic abuse. Now, we can certainly see it where in our faculty and staff and teachers, the spouse knows where their partner goes to school and has those interventions. We were talking this morning with a group out of Rochester where a teacher was killed in a murder-suicide scenario. This is domestic abuse is a significant problem, and it also affects the students. It's just not the adult faculty here and experiencing it. And you will learn a lot of, in many cases, of this for the first time, again, so via social media postings of what others are saying about what's going on in those lives. And finally, suicide. Any cry or threat of suicide certainly is a call to action for all of us. Now, we're finding, unfortunately, that suicide is linked with kill lists, where they're planning to even a score and then commit suicide, whether it's by their own hand or death by cop associated with it. And that's an important element for us to consider. The attacks that occurred in Seattle just after the late last year, where the young man invited everyone that he had a grudge with to meet him at lunch in the cafeteria at the table, and then comes in and attacks them at that point in time. We regularly respond to suicide threats and issues and find that there are kill lists that are involved. You need to keep that at the top of your list to keep in mind, as well as the indicators that are associated with it. Now, the action plan that I said we'd mentioned, it must be regularly reviewed. When you've identified a behavior of concern, if they're in that monitoring, there has to be a specific plan of what you're going to do with them until you have deemed that they're no longer a risk to themselves or others. Keeping that action plan current, reviewing it weekly within your behavioral assessment team, doing the monitoring of how is this person doing in the classroom, whether they're a student or a teacher, what's been going on, what is the monitoring telling us off of social media, how does this intelligent network come together, and you want to disseminate this plan to all those personnel that are involved, every one of the person's teachers, the administration in looking at this and carrying forward, anyone that has legitimate behavioral interest in that particular person as we would come together. So this is an issue for us to be concerned about. This is a very real problem in all of our schools, whether they're public, private, or independent. this is an area for us to be concerned about today. Today you're doing specific things. You need to document and train your people. You need to make sure that everyone is aware as we go forward. The level of documentation needs to be significantly increased. After looking at and auditing and benchmarking many of the schools, we're finding that they don't have all of this as formalized. Now, I took a page out of one of the behavioral risk threat assessment programs that we're doing, and this just is one of the phases as you look at it, and it's the investigation and categorization phase, and it goes on for multiple pages. Now, a common approach here is you see the checking of a box when that's done in a particular situation. You see who it's assigned to and who has the responsibility, and then you receive the report, and immediately the life safety question, is this so serious that it's outside that gray areas of behaviors of concern? We need to refer it to the authorities. That's clearly a highlight element. Then we have to create the analysis that looks at it, ensure where they are, and supervision associated with this. We can't leave them unsupervised because we're now on notice that there was a behavior of concern. We then need to move into doing the incident report. Do you have a form for that? As you see referenced here, including in this plan where it's shown, and then doing exactly the same steps and gathering the complete information every time. There's no such thing here as a minor incident and we're not going to follow procedures. Common theme, if we're explaining we're losing, you've got to do the same thing every time on every report. And then you start going through the investigation. You'd interview the person, you'd interview parents, teachers, others that were involved, meeting with and carrying through and moving forward. This is only a small portion of the level of detail that you would need, but I thought if you saw a real example, it might help as we think about creating this intelligence network. So what are the next steps? Do you want to know what will happen tomorrow? If you don't, then okay, we're through. If you do want to know, then we can talk about how we can help you. If you say no, can you really afford not to know what's going to happen tomorrow? That information is out there. It's out there with the clue cues. It's out there with the behaviors of concern. It's out there with the intelligence and data network that's there, whether it's soft or hard data. You can contact Firestorm to learn how to align your plans with standards and best practices. You can create your own intelligence network or to schedule some training on how to do the screening and how to carry this forward and how to develop the plans or to do the monitoring. Any of those things would be available. Additionally, if you'd like to know how your plans align to standards and best practices, whether it's preparedness or emergency plans, crisis management, workplace violence, or even the behavioral risk assessments or the intelligence network, we're glad to do that. RenWeb has underwritten the cost of that for you. You can have a self-assessment done for free at no fee to your school. It's a $2,500 value. And our thanks to RenWeb for hosting and co-sponsoring this webinar series and making that service available to you. If you have questions or would like to review this webinar again, you can go to firestorm.com. You can do /RenWeb and see it coded there, or search our website and have a link to this particular session, or share it with others so that they could view it on demand at their convenience. If you've got specific questions, you can contact us at webinars@firestorm.com, or you can call us at 800-321-2219. We're going to make every effort to reach out to everyone on the call today to see if there are questions that we can answer about creating your own intelligence network and what's involved with behaviors of risk. We know that tomorrow there will be a school in America who's going to face a problem. They're going to have an event that occurs. It will be coming and starting from a behavior of concern that's going to escalate to threatening behavior, to violence, and we hope not, but in some cases death. To know how to deal with that, having a system, having it documented, it's extremely important. If having a fence around your school or a lock on the door of the school or a video camera or any other security measure is important, having a behavior of concern program in place and having that where everyone's aware, everyone's trained, and you've got the systems in place to deal with it become critical. We thank you for your time. We thank you for what you're doing for our young people today. We look forward to seeing you again at one of the upcoming RenWeb meetings and for the rest of this 3-webinar series this quarter as we continue on building an intelligence network in your school. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day. We look forward to speaking with you again soon. Goodbye.